I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to a video conference edition of the New York Times Close Up. Before we begin, a thank you from all of us in journalism to Pete Hamill, a generous colleague and impassioned voice of New York and local news, and for the underdog and a free press. Pete died this week. He will be sorely missed. This week, you could get whiplash trying to keep up with Donald Trump's position on the coronavirus. For months, he denied it was a major health crisis, dismissed mask wearing, pushed states to reopen, and promoted debunked treatments. Then, Texas, Florida, many red states became COVID hotspots. Suddenly, he flip-flopped. He said the crisis was going to get worse before it gets better, and he even urged people to wear masks. That lasted a week. Then another head spinning about face. Trump went back to urging businesses and schools to reopen. He falsely claimed most states were COVID-free, and he retweeted a video of a quack doctor pushing bogus COVID miracle cures. And after some awful economic numbers came out last week, he floated the idea of delaying the election. Even GOP leaders quickly dismissed that one. Meanwhile, Joe Biden continues with what the Times called a do no harm strategy. He's been talking policy, laying out an economic plan that ties a recovery to racial justice. And he's wielding what could be his best political weapon, Barack Obama. As for the polls, The Economist YouGo has Biden up by 9 points over Trump. And as for Trump's job approval, Gallup has it at 41% approve, 56% disapprove. Now we're 3 months out from the election. That's a long time. What is the state of play? We're joined by Peter Baker, the Times' chief White House correspondent, and Reed Epstein, a political correspondent for the Times. Peter, you talked about in an article in the Times Trump's campaign to undermine democracy, talking about delegitimizing the election. Just how far can he go, and how much damage could he do if that is indeed his goal?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, we see all the time people complain about the political system and arguing that it's been rigged or in some way unfair. You've never seen that from somebody sitting in the Oval Office. This is an unusual, if not unprecedented circumstance where a sitting president of the United States is essentially telling voters that the system cannot be trusted. FactBase, which is this great online service that tracks President Trump's statements and analyzes them, came up with a number of 91 times as of last week that he had raised this idea of voter fraud this year alone, 700 times going back to 2012. So this is a historic trend of his. And in doing so, it's not a question of whether the election will be delayed. There's really not much chance of that. Constitutionally, it's not really in the president's hands, and most Republicans, as you say, were pretty quick to say no way. It's the fact that he's telling people that the result can't be trusted. Now, this is an incumbent who's behind by double digits in most of the polls. You can argue he's setting, a narrative already to explain why he might lose. But the larger damage, I think, is one of credibility in the system. Democracy depends on faith that whatever its flaws, an election is fundamentally fair and free. And if that's something that he's telling his supporters that they shouldn't trust, then we're in a bigger place, in a more dangerous place, I think, than we had expected to be.
Peter, how does he reconcile that with him winning, not the popular vote, but the electoral vote in 2016? Why could we trust that election and not this one?
Well, he won that one. That's why we can trust it. And look, even then he cast doubt on that election. You remember in the days leading up to the election, he was telling everybody it's going to be rigged and so forth, not too unlike what he's saying now. Then when he won, of course, he was happy and claimed, victory with the Electoral College. But even then he told people that he really had won the popular vote because 3 million people, illegal immigrants, had voted for Hillary Clinton. No proof of that whatsoever. It seems to be something he literally made up out of whole cloth. He appointed a commission to investigate. Even his own commission didn't find any evidence of this sort of fanciful claim. But he refuses to accept any election result that doesn't include himself as the winner. And I think that's something we've never seen again from a sitting president.
Rhea, tell me if I'm wrong. I think we are pretty much through with the primaries this year. What can we say about them in this past week? What did they mean? What did they tell us about what they portend for November?
There's a few left. Don't
Okay.
Massachusetts and Delaware. There's a
Sorry
couple
to
big
hear
Senate
that.
primaries left. What we know from the primaries is that there's been a surge of Democratic turnout across the board, even in states where the presidential race had been decided. We saw a lot more Democrats come out and vote in a lot of these places than Republicans, and more than we had expected, especially relative to the 2016 and 2018 primaries. What does that mean for November? It means that Democrats are energized to vote, and whether Republicans are is a little bit to be determined still. We don't. There's plenty of evidence that President Trump has lost pieces of his electoral coalition that helped him in 2016. He certainly has had big losses in the suburbs from what he had, but Democrats remain pretty nervous and wary, especially given how close the last election was in some of these key states in the upper Midwest, and how close it may be again this time.
Peter, speaking of close, I'm not a great believer in national polls, especially when so much seems to come down to battleground states, the 4 or 5, half dozen states where the election is more likely to be determined. I also, and maybe I'm too cynical, don't believe polls when people have to talk about race. So what is the impact likely to be if Joe Biden picks a Black woman as his running mate? Despite what people say, despite people in the mood of Black Lives Matter wanting to sound like they're interested in equality and open-minded, is there likely to be any backlash that isn't showing up in the polls, and a backlash to also calls to defund the police, behead Columbus and Washington and other historic American heroes, and also protests that have or may yet get out of hand? Is Trump likely to benefit from all of that in a way that is unseen to us at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sam. And you and I have been around long enough to remember when we used to call it the Tom Bradley effect, back when Tom Bradley ran for governor of California, would have been the first African-American governor, and the polls all showed him winning. And in fact, in the end, he didn't. That disparity between the polls and the actual result was attributed by people, by experts, saying that people were, afraid to tell pollsters they were against him for fear of looking like they might be seen as racist. I covered the 1989 race in Virginia that L. Douglas Wilder won. He was the first African-American ever to win a governor's race in the United States. And the difference between his poll numbers and the actual result, even though he won, was still striking. That's a long time ago, though. I don't know whether that's still a factor today, or at least as big a factor. It may depend on who the candidate is. It may depend on who, what she does, assuming, he says he's going to pick a woman as a candidate. Look, vice presidential running mates usually don't make a huge difference unless it's a mistake, right? The do no harm slogan you just mentioned applies to picking a running mate. You're not likely to help yourself too much, but you can hurt yourself. And that's the big factor that Joe Biden has to take into account. But I think there's so many uncertainties this year. There's so many volatile possibilities. Will people show up to vote in person in the middle of a pandemic? How will mail-in voting work, given how badly the collection worked in New York in these 2 congressional races? The president's using false assertions about widespread fraud, but it is true that the system has not had a lot of success in some places in terms of processing large numbers of mail-in ballots. Some places where they have a lot of experience, they do very well. So there's going to be a test of a lot of states and the postal system right now seems to be struggling a great deal. So we don't know. There's so many factors to take into account that I think Rita's right that we can't assume just because we know what the poll numbers say today that we know how that's going to play out in 90 days.
Rita, apart from the vote by mail situation, what is the effect likely to be, as best we can tell it now, of the pandemic, and particularly of the president's reaction to it? Is there likely to be an October surprise that we have a miracle vaccine? Has the president's denial washed anymore? Is it likely to have an impact? And then we have the situation later this month, certainly in September, of schools either opening or not. The president says they should open. The president's son's own school is not opening. So how is he going to reconcile all these things, reconcile his past statements and his flip-flops on this issue?
Oh, I mean, you should ask our colleague Don McNeil about a vaccine. He knows a lot more about it than I think any of us do. But certainly, schools not opening is a huge issue. And we've heard, especially a lot of these swing voters, sort of white working class voters in the Midwest. One thing that I've been hearing from pollsters and people who spend a lot of time in Ohio and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania is that historically women, white working class women vote the same as their husband, but they're seeing some break in that demographic this year because women are the ones who focus more and make a lot of decisions about school and healthcare. And with public schools closing in most parts of the country and people having difficulty taking care of elderly parents, people getting sick and not being able to have access to care that they need, in part because due to the pandemic, that they think they're seeing more white working class women break from President Trump and Republicans than they have in the past. And while for Democrats that is encouraging, it's not certain whether that trend is going to last through November. You're right that we don't know what President Trump will say or do, either to cast doubt on the integrity of the election or frankly anything else. And so 90 days doesn't seem like a long time, but with a president who creates new news cycles every 2 to 3 hours, it's a long time before the election. But ballots go out in some states in about a month, and so people are going to start voting relatively soon.
They're going to vote relatively soon, and Peter, that means the president is running out of time to try and change those polls, if indeed they are correct. What can Trump do to reverse things? If he is indeed losing, if he feels he's losing, if he's feeling desperate, how far can he go? Is there anything he can really do politically or otherwise to turn things around?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one thing he can do is turn it into a contest between him and Joe Biden instead of a referendum on himself, right? For months, because of the COVID and because Biden has successfully kept a low profile, and because Trump, of course, doesn't keep a low profile, it's all been about him. It's all Trump. You're either for him or against him. That's what this election so far has really been about. That's not a winning prescription, at least in the eyes of most political experts and even Trump's own advisors. The goal here for them is to make it a choice between Trump, however flawed he might be, and a more flawed, in the Trump view, Democratic challenger who either is too decrepit to be president or too captive of the far left to be trusted. And that's the narrative you're seeing that Trump camp trying to put out. It hasn't been successful so far. But at some point, you imagine that when people are focused a little bit more on the race, when Biden might come out and spend a little bit more time in the public, when there will be, presumably, we think, debates and the two of them are head to head, there might be more of an opportunity for Trump to make it a us versus them kind of choice. That's his strong ground anyway. Us versus them politics is where he is most comfortable, most confident. That's the ground he wants to be playing on. He hasn't been able to so far because it's only been a choice between Trump and not Trump right now is winning.
Reed, what do you think of the impact of Barack Obama? Is he a real, not secret weapon, but great weapon in the hands of Joe Biden?
Well, he certainly helped Joe Biden raise a ton of money from donors who were Obama supporters or still admire the former president. One thing that Peter said that I think is important is that Trump has sort of been casting about in how to define Joe Biden over the last few months without any real consistent message that he's been hitting over and over again, while Joe Biden and Democrats have really been saying pretty much the same thing about Trump for now going on 5 years. And one of the real problems for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago was that this definition had built up about her sort of in the popular culture that she just wasn't able to shake. And with Biden, there isn't sort of a negative definition like that exists, despite Trump's repeated efforts to tag one onto him.
And as you say, that early voting is going to start pretty soon and running out of time to do things. Speaking of which, my thanks to Peter Baker and Reed Epstein of the New York Times. And coming up next, New York City takes another step in reopening its economy. New York seems to have beaten back the coronavirus so far. The city is now in phase 4 of reopening the economy, but with plenty of limits. Restaurants, bars, museums still closed, Broadway still dark, big questions about reviving the city's critical tourism industry. And meanwhile, the Times reports that 1/3 of New York's small businesses may be gone forever. Office buildings are open, but the overwhelming majority of office workers are staying away. The Times headline described Midtown as a ghost town, with the article saying, quote, Midtown Manhattan, the muscular power center of New York City for a century, faces an economic catastrophe, a cascade of loss upon loss that threatens to alter the very identity of the city's corporate base. The coronavirus's toll of lost professions, lost professionals, and untold billions of lost income and tax revenue may take years to understand and resolve. So where are we on the road to recovery? We're joined by two experts, J. David Goodman, a Metro reporter for the New York Times, and Matthew Haig, also a Times Metro reporter. David, you reported this week that the health commissioner of the de Blasio administration quit, complaining that the mayor was resisting some calls to close down schools, debating his policy on contact tracing. What does that mean, and what does that say about the city's response to the virus?
Well, I think it's a disturbing development, because what it says is that you have this discord at the top of the city's sort of healthcare apparatus, that although we're in a period of relative calm when it comes to the virus outbreak, we're still very much in a critical stage in terms of maintaining the gains and seeing the city into a reopening period. And we're going to need everybody sort of working together to get there. And so this doubt that was cast on the mayor's leadership by the departing health commissioner was not very encouraging. And one of the things that she's criticized the mayor for, and that the mayor has come under criticism from others for, is having put the control of the contact tracing program, which is very important for maintaining the levels that we have now and trying to track down new outbreaks inside of the hospital system and not in the health department where it's traditionally been. That was the crux of their disagreement, and the mayor ultimately won out, and she left.
Very rare that we see public officials quit. In this case, who's right, and what's the impact of it on public health?
Who is right, you asked?
Yeah, I mean, is the health commissioner right, or is the mayor right?
I think the mayor and his staff have compiled a bunch of data points that show where they believe the health department had failed on the virus. Now, the mayor is very sensitive because he's come under criticism himself for being slow in the early days of March to really lock down the city. And at that point, he was disagreeing with the advice that he was getting from the health department. And so on that score, I think the health department was correct. On this issue of the contact tracing, I think the jury's still out. We have a large apparatus that's been set up. The mayor sort of conceded that the health department is necessary for that effort by charging them with actually doing the most complicated contact tracing. They're going to do the restaurants. They're going to do when people are in schools. They're going to take the lead in already for homeless shelters and for other congregate settings. And so the health department had a point that they have the expertise and need to be involved. The mayor's point was, we all have to be together on this. And, he sort of forced his hand. And I think, maybe a different manager may have figured out a way to get everyone to work together rather than to sort of sideline some of the dissenting voices.
Matthew, you reported in the Times this week that as many as 1/3 of the small businesses in the city may be gone forever as a result of the pandemic. What's the impact of that going to be? We're talking about workers, we're talking about empty storefronts, landlords not collecting rent, taxes down, consumers not having a place to buy, people not being able to go to certain restaurants. Is this a short-term problem that will resolve itself in a year or two, or is this a fundamental problem that the city is facing now?
Well, Sam, it's a fundamental problem. As we have discussed, that the first 2 months of this crisis was really a health crisis. It just took an enormous toll on lives in New York City. But now that we're almost 5 months into this, the economic crisis is going to be monumental and last for a long, long time. There are so many for lease signs, even in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. I walk Fifth Avenue, Madison Avenue. There are more every day. And each small business, each restaurant, each bodega has employees. It trickles down. It goes to the tax base. There was a restaurant I spoke to in Brooklyn, Gladys, a Caribbean restaurant. They had 56 employees in March. They're down to 7. The store closed. The landlord would not give an inch on the lease. And so you're going to see more vacancies. You're going to see unemployment. It's a huge crisis there, and it doesn't seem to have an end date. As this economy stays sluggish, as restaurants have less than 50% capacity, which is not enough, they tell me, to make a profit or break even unless they get a huge break on their rent. It's just hard to imagine how New York gets out of this crisis anytime soon.
David, is there any bright side to this? Midtown is a ghost town, but then we see the story about the Facebook lease in the Farley post office building. Are rents going to go down, even though landlord expenses are likely not to change? And, there'll be a surge of people coming in to rent space, or I'm grasping for straws here.
Yeah, well, I think one, a bright spot you might say that's been there all along is the fact that though those office buildings are empty, the people that worked in them are, for the most part, still employed, at least the ones that have, white-collar jobs. This recession hasn't yet impacted those sectors, although that is a concern that this will, all these fundamentals that Matt's describing are going to impact parts of the economy that haven't been hit yet. But for the time being, New Yorkers who can work at home are still employed for the most part, and those companies are still in those buildings. They've opened up. No one's working in the buildings. But I spent a week actually living in Midtown when I came back from Texas and needed to quarantine there. And walking around there truly is a sort of, it's where I grew up, in fact. And so it's really dispiriting to see that the streets really resembled more or less the 1990s, but during the day. And there's nobody really coming in to commute. And so these problems are profound. But I do think there's still the expectation that, people are still working in these buildings, and there'll be some kind of way to get people back into them at some point soon.
Matt, what do you think? You've looked at it pretty closely. Is there going to be a long-term impact, as you say? And what is the effect on mass transit and all sorts of other ancillary things like that?
Well, what was so surprising about the Facebook deal, not in so much that they leased the building and that they were looking at it for a long time, perhaps a year, many months before the pandemic, but it shows that companies like Facebook still have a lot of faith in the future of office space, and especially in an urban setting. From Penn Station on down to the Hudson River, that's becoming a tech corridor, with Facebook having 2.5 million almost square feet of office space, which would be 10,000 employees that they don't have currently in the city. And so companies are making a huge bet on the future, that office space, as David mentioned, will come back, that there will be a desire to have collaborative rooms and office spaces, and we work near each other, and we're missing out on so much of that right now. But mass transit is a huge issue. As we know, that's what helped spread the virus at the very beginning. And a lot of people are hesitant to jump back on the subway now to go into work when that day arrives.
David, the Times had an editorial this week, once again asking the mayor and the governor to stop quibbling and try to work together in the face of this crisis. What is the impact of the pandemic likely to be on local politics, particularly with a mayoral race coming up?
I think it completely scrambles everyone's campaigns and what voters are going to be looking for in a next mayor. I mean, I think already you've seen some concern and some more quiet coming out of the city council speaker, Corey Johnson, who was seeming like a pretty good candidate, a front runner, in the sense that he was very positive. He had a good presence and seemed to really know how to navigate the city and get out there and get his sort of himself out in front of voters. But now, the question is, do voters, or will voters want a person who's never managed anything really to be in charge of the city in one of its deepest crises? And now, so you see more and more people jumping in. I think the field is likely to get bigger before it gets smaller. It had seemed like there weren't that many candidates a little while ago, and now it seems like there's a ton. I mean, the restrictions on campaign finance, or the way the campaign finance system works now in the city, is going to make it even more appealing for people to get in. And so I think we're going to have after the 2020 presidential election is over, we're going to have a mad sprint. And I really don't think it's possible to predict at this point who comes out ahead, but it does change the kinds of things and the kinds of qualities that voters are going to want out of the next mayor.
Given the economy, given the Black Lives Matter movement, is it more likely they're going to look for a business person or a minority person?
It's hard to tell. I mean, most folks are, even within the business community, are thinking, we need to have a candidate who is, we need to have essentially a Black candidate who can also carry a business-friendly message. Because clearly, having another white guy mayor is not going to work in New York City in 2021. And so there needs to be a candidate of color, I think, that comes comes to the fore here. It's not clear who that person is right now. People who've announced already, including Eric Adams, have a case to make. They also have some negatives on, and they don't have a lot of confidence from business leaders at the moment. So there's still a search among those folks, but whether those folks have any influence over politics in the city right now is another open question. I think, especially
as we know, things happen very quickly in politics in New York. Thanks to David Goodman, Matthew Haig of the New York Times, and for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.